Thank you for joining us for Superheroes and Villains, the Evolution of Hackers. My name is Michael Mays. I'm a writer and researcher here at Armor. Before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about some of the housekeeping tips here. If you will, everyone will be on mute throughout the webinar. We'll also record the webinar, so you'll have a chance to see after it's edited. It'll be sent out to all the participants. Recommend that you use the chat function to let us know of any technical issues or sound issues that you might have. We'll correct those. And use the function also to ask questions. We'll take your questions at the end, but you can submit them at any time, and we'll take a look at them in the end. Joining me today is Raph Los, who is the Vice President of Security here at Armor. 20 years within the cybersecurity industry, 10 years talking about threats, and he's also the host of the popular podcast Down the Rabbit Hole. Tell us a little bit about your role here at Armor.
Yep, Raph Los, VP of cybersecurity here at Armor. My job is to really work with our partner and customer ecosystem to help deliver solutions, help scope ideas, and make sure that we deliver on our promises.
That's great. Well, thank you for joining us today. A little bit about our agenda. We're going to talk about the evolution of hackers, a little bit of a background and what we've seen over 3 decades, and we'll analyze the attacker, the hackers, and the defenders, and talk a little bit about the outcomes of that fight. We'll take a look at some of the lessons that we've learned over those 3 decades, and we'll talk about suggested strategies for the future. Of course, finally, we'll take some of your questions. Before we get started, we'd like to ask a few flash polls during the webinar, and so we can talk about some of the things that you're interested in. Before we get started, how has your image of the term hacker changed over the last decade?
I bet it's changed significantly. Let's find out.
A lot of changes.
Well, as we let people answer here, the evolution, I think, is fairly dramatic. I suspect that I know for me it's changed quite a bit.
Just looking here for some of the results of the polls that are coming in. Has it changed in a positive way? Has it really become more of a negative term? Most of what we see is certainly coming from the media.
It is coming from the media, absolutely, and that image is being driven a lot by the news cycles and movies and cinema. And look at that. As you would expect, it's become more negative, right? The hacker in a hoodie.
Right.
I wish that graphic would go away.
Well, in the sense of what we're seeing, of course, movies that we've seen in 1983, War Games, which really kind of scared us into thinking that a teenager, right? A young Angelina Jolie in Hackers, right?
Memorable.
The ultimate hack, perhaps, in the Matrix.
With the SSH exploit there, that was brilliant, yeah.
Well, and you see some of these hackers like in TV, with Elliot Alderson and Mr. Robot. They seem to have these amazing powers, and able to, almost godlike.
Yeah, almost root-like. So that hacker has, the term's definitely gone through a dramatic change, I think, in the last several years. We've actually broken it down for our sake here, for the sake of this conversation, into 4 sections. You've got the enthusiast, you've got the cyber criminal, the hacktivist, and nation state actor. Of course, this is completely, putting aside the folks that work in the enterprise and business tirelessly all day, and the consultants and all that, right? So we're just talking from the I guess, hacker/attacker perspective. So we're trying to get through that term and as eloquently and as non-offensively as possible, right?
We'll get more into each one of those categories as we go.
Excellent.
As we analyze the attacker and defender evolution, we've begun to really take a look at it in the sense of some specific time periods, and we'll break it down into some of the actors within that. We'll talk about what was really happening before 2000, everything really from 1960s MIT students who were playing around, tinkering, to the real evolution that started in around 2000. And then we'll move even through that and really talk about how after 2012 some things happened that really began an arms race.
Yeah, that certainly had some very life-altering events in our industry. We'll go through 3 dimensions of each of these. We'll talk about the hackers themselves, how they've evolved, the characteristics and motivations, and the different types of threats that they posed. looking at the defenders, right, the good guys, air quotes. What is their kind of strategic focus, the kind of way they operated, and some of the challenges they faced. And of course, because we care, we want to go talk about the outcome. What happened as a result of all of it?
How have we done actually?
Yeah,
in that
right.
battle,
Has any of it mattered?
Well, taking a look at the first period,
We commonly referred to as the good old days, right?
well, that's right. The good old days were never today. You know, before 2000, we had a type of hacker. It was really a tinkerer, those who really like to build and break things, right? Primarily enthusiasts. There were some who were really looking for advantage, but they were mostly motivated by curiosity, fame, really,
Because you can.
because they could. And then there was some criminal activity, learning to kind of steal information, or maybe even if you think about in terms of, having free phone service. But the threat level was really a commodity attacker, right? They were typically exploiting typical weak vulnerabilities that are easy to really defend against.
Right. And speaking of defending, right, from a strategic perspective and the focus, really wasn't a whole lot of strategy to it, right? I remember those days. I was there. You were there. We changed up. We took all the packet filtering firewalls, IPFW. We started applying patches because those were becoming a big thing. Every couple days, something new had to be patched. We made sure antivirus was installed, and that was pretty much it, right? It was tactical. We didn't do a whole lot of forward thinking in it, configurations maybe, but at the time, you probably didn't have a good formal security team. It was a lot of IT and a security person that was there kind of to think about security a little bit, but that was closer to 2000. And an attacker perspective, or sorry, from the challenge perspective, you've got you've got a commodity attacker. So what does that mean? That means that they're going to be focusing on the common weaknesses, the stuff that's easily exploitable. They're there for fun. They're not there to be super sophisticated. They're not going to try to wreak havoc. It wasn't altogether super difficult to be a defender back then, although it still was.
Well, when we take a look at the outcomes of that effort, right? We find that still, despite all that effort, we continue to see attacks and they continue to evolve.
Yeah, so exploitations of vulnerabilities across the corporate infrastructure. So we saw that was, servers got popped, websites got defaced. I think the most common thing was websites got defaced as a form of protest or just because they were cool. There's a lot of things that a lot of switches were made from, I installed my first firewall around 99, 2000. Initial investments in what we now call enterprise security or cybersecurity. But it was just all getting started. We call those the good old days.
Well, some of the things that happened during that, some notable events, obviously we saw the very first legislation for cyber crimes, that were enacted around 1986. And then we saw the evolution of the crackers, right? Folks who were really getting in for malicious activity. Kevin Mitnick, he broke into DEC, then he was arrested, spent a year, broke out, and then another kind of hacking spree and spent 5 years in prison. So we started seeing people in prison. Kevin Polson was someone who hacked into a radio station so he could win a Porsche.
Yeah.
But really, when you're thinking about this time too, in the early days, Julian Assange was a young hacker here. At that time, he had broken into NASA, into Lockheed Martin, and into the Pentagon.
Yeah.
And so, all of those pre-WikiLeaks.
Whistling the nuclear launch codes and all that fun stuff. A lot of stuff happened back then. A lot of very interesting stuff that made for good movies.
Right.
And books.
Well, and these commodity threats are really taking a shotgun approach. You use the term fishing with dynamite.
Yeah.
Right. But these are typically easily defended against. Again, these commodity threats, they're about 80% of kind of what's happening out there even still today.
And that remains today, right? It's not that there weren't sophisticated attackers. It's not, well, sophisticated was a different term back then, but it's not that there weren't people that were targeting specific infrastructures or applications or companies. It's that a lot of it was basically the jewelry store, drive through the window, grab what you can and leave, or it was simple defacements or other stuff like that. I mean, we started seeing worms become prolific for a while there around the late 90s, early 2000s. I remember, like viruses came on floppy disks and they locked up your boot sector, right? Those days are long behind us, and boy, at the time, it was one of those like, oh, it's so bad. Now, kind of long for those days.
You bet. Well, as things began to evolve. We really began to see a kind of chaotic evolution really beginning in 2000. Everything from the development of the first cyber weapons and other things. These attackers are much more organized, typically have organized criminal groups, right?
Yeah.
Who even hire for certain roles.
Yeah.
And then you have hacktivist
verticalization
groups.
of the criminal market, sir. That's a thing.
Right. And then, of course, you have the hacktivist groups. You have Anonymous and WikiLeaks really emerged in 2006, 2018. And then you have motivations here during this period, certainly for financial gain, for stealing of intellectual property, and with the hacktivists, for ideological kinds of motivations. But as a threat level, they are much more targeted and much more sophisticated, in some cases using tradecraft. So these hackers are still an important threat today.
Yeah, and as you would imagine, as the hackers and the attackers got better, the defenders tried to keep pace, right? And we went from this basic pattern-based prevention, we started evolving, but it was really all about, the IDS, the Snort was a big deal. All these different antivirus platforms came out. It was an arms race to, as quickly as you possibly can, find some piece of malware, understand the pattern, disseminate it as quickly as you can so to block. There was always going to be a patient 0, but you didn't want to be patient 200, right? So that was really what it was about. SIM became a thing, and SIM, I guess, is still a thing because we still haven't arguably gotten it right, but it became the epicenter for the SOC and threat detection, right? Everybody decided that we needed to, we had too many consoles, so we're going to point all of our logs at a security incident event management thing. It was going to churn its thing, do some correlation, and spit out where the bad guys were. Didn't work so well, but there was a million implementations. Seemingly everybody had to have one. We experimented some with anomaly detection up until then. That was always an interesting behavioral detection, anomaly detection, network-based. Later on, user anomaly-based. But it all worked at really small lab scales until you got into some big scale. From an operating perspective, right, the formalization of an enterprise security team, right, people became security professionals. And whereas today we are hyper-focused and hyper-specialized, we'll cover that a little bit later, the general concept of being a security professional came into being, and the Security Operations Center evolved, right? We had a place where there were people that were there 24/7 by 365, staring at screens, identifying when the little light blinked red and we should go do something about it. And then, of course, the emergence of platforms and the same again comes back to us. But we started chunking things together because we realized having 17 different screens was going to be difficult, and so we started evolving that a little bit. But along the lines of challenges, right, exploitation continues to be at the enterprise level, and it got bigger. We started exploiting. 0 days became a real thing. People started sharing scripts and sharing proof of concept code, and that stuff started getting interesting. And of course, as that happened, the script kiddies and all that stuff evolved too.
Right. So lots of tools, the budgets are growing, people are paying more attention. So what was the outcome of all of that? Really?
Well, so the reliance on tools started ramping pretty high, right? Because we didn't have the methods to find the badness by hand. So we, of course, ran into the area where we focused on the tools. Every vendor was selling something, we were buying, and it was obvious. And so detection capabilities, prevention capabilities, everything was 100% detection for 100% of the time. That worked every other Sunday. And SOCs set up with increasing regularity, so we kept getting more people working in the Security Operations Center, the whole concept of having tiered analysts, dashboards, and that, again, the increasing reliance on the SIM as everybody built one and then rebuilt it and then rebuilt it again. And I think we're still on phase 4 of rebuild.
And despite all of that work, still we continue to see escalation of events. We continue to see changes in techniques.
That's right. It still continued to happen. It's almost as if we weren't really good at it, or there was something going on that wasn't working.
Well, it seemed like the Black Hats were collaborating a lot better together, and maybe we weren't collaborating.
They don't have the politics that we have to deal with, right? So what about major events? Anything interesting happen?
through this particular period, there's a lot. You know, we did see the first kind of attacks on corporations and government entities in the terms of DDoS kinds of attacks.
That's right. DDoS for hire happened. Yeah.
Right. We saw the evolution, of course, of the hacktivists. You know, even during this 2009 was the introduction of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. So that leads kind of into where we're going.
Shortly thereafter, hacking
right.
of those things.
That's right. Right. Stealing of those things from exchanges. You know, but so this targeted threat, the B-level threat, these cyber criminals are really about 20% of what we see. They're highly targeted activity. They're much better than the shotgun approach. They are human controlled, and they do tend to have some tradecraft. And they're typically out for financial gain.
Okay, and that makes sense, right? Because with the increased risk of going to jail, the increased regulations, the increased we'll call it militarization of maybe it's the wrong word, but the increase in how much security spend we had, the likelihood of getting caught went up. So obviously hacking with a purpose at this point, right? You're gonna go get something if you're gonna go put yourself on the line for it.
Right, they're getting much better at covering their tracks.
They certainly were.
So when we look to 2012 through today, really, we see an arms race. This is really the growth of the state-sponsored threat groups. Now, they've certainly been around as long as we've had military, but you know, with these groups now, we see the proliferation of weapons that really are somewhat on par to nuclear weapons to some. What you have are they're well-funded, their motivations are political, but they also have financial motivations as well. That we find that certainly in terms of some of the crypto mining and other things that we see. There's lots of identity theft, just pulling of records. And these are advanced targets, advanced persistent threats who are well-funded. They are professionals, and they are leveraging government resources.
Yeah, so as that market, like as the cyber criminals verticalized and specialized, the term cold cyber warfare came into being, and there's some crazy words that have been phrases that have been thrown around over the last 10, 12 years. But I think ultimately where we're down to is the fact that there really is essentially an arms race between the good guys and the bad guys, and in a formal sort of way. Nation states are pitted against each other, our capabilities, how much we fund in the darkness, and how much gets done by private contractors, much like everything else, military and government related, right? So you've got a lot of pressures going on there. From a strategic perspective on the defender side, we really have been trying to broadly look at the NIST CSF and look at how do we identify, prevent, or protect, detect, respond, and then think about recovering. Security has largely up until Saudi Aramco, and that really became a thing. I'll let you talk about that in a second, but we really that really, I don't know, maybe just solidified a lot of that in our minds, that this is a big deal. Like bad things, really bad things can happen on a very grand scale. So, and if we didn't know where our assets were, we couldn't protect them. If you couldn't at least baseline detect, you're not going to protect everything, but then you detect all the things that get through that protective barrier. Respond, right? Get incident response, decrease dwell times, identify who the attackers were, where they went, what they took, where they're going, what their motivations were, with all the extra intelligence or threat data that's in the market now. And then, of course, recovery as the crypto locker types of attacks continued to escalate. Recover suddenly became an important thing. Like all those backups we've been doing for years that we never tested whether you could actually recover from, those were suddenly a big deal, right? And the focus became on largely an enterprise scale, like a big kid response. Could we do all those things in a meaningful way that didn't break the budget? We started talking about adding logging and analytics optimization so that we weren't getting alert fatigue, because everybody that's worked in the enterprise side has gotten a SIM that throws 100,000 alerts a day, and suddenly you're like, this is meaningless. This is just as meaningless as if I've got nothing, right? And many times worse, actually, because now you're collecting evidence against yourself, which will be great for discovery. But we started focusing on holistic enterprise response strategies and response plans and crisis management. I'm not saying we've been great at it, but that stuff has started proliferating in our brains. And from an operations model, like we're starting to look at operationalizing and optimizing the SIM. And a lot of the companies that you and I talk to every day, they're looking at it and going, we don't really even need to do this ourselves, because I don't have the resources. I could probably hire somebody from like the C team, but why would I when I can hire, a partner with somebody, I can hire like 10 of the A team, not like the A team, but the A team.
And then giving them all those things to focus on. What did they really know to
Absolutely.
do once they actually have
right, having policies and procedures in place that, this is the stuff that goes along.
Right.
And so a lot of this the strategy and a lot of the outcomes that happen as a result really focus on how do we streamline what we do, formalize what we do. And something else I've noticed is the security market has hyper specialized. There are people now that are experts in Mac forensics, right? Like there used to be in the 90s and 2000s, in the pre-2010 or so, I'm a security expert. Now you're a cybersecurity expert specializing in this, and that. I mean, the cloud.
Chainalysis, who's doing work on Bitcoin tracking
Yeah.
these days, right?
Yeah, and then of course the cloud, right? Because the cloud changed everything again.
Well, yeah. So despite all of that effort, again, we're still finding ourselves in this same period. Massive breaches, massive ransomware spreading rampantly across the country or across the world. Some of the things that happened here, we mark this by the Saudi Aramco hack, which happened in August of 2012.
Yeah.
30,000 Windows-based systems were infected immediately. And then, during this period too, I think it's worth noting that, we saw the rise of and the introduction of the Silk Road, which created a marketplace, and it became the model for marketplaces today in which hackers are sharing hacker services and tools, and they're openly sold.
Yeah, and also all the criminal activity that goes along with it, right? Murder for hire and other interesting things that you can find down there. But the trends, like you said, budgets have continued to climb. This is the disturbing part. Is I think we've sort of said, okay, if we just get enough money, we'll solve this thing, and we've gotten. And everybody used to complain about it, but now budgets are so big, and it turns out no matter how much budget you get, no matter how big the company you are still just as likely to get popped as anybody else. I mean, it's really become a matter of scale. And security teams continue to grow, but what's the problem there? You're running into the same issue that everybody else has, is where do you hire these people from, right? And are they well trained? And as your CISO becomes part of the boardroom, this is the part of this that I particularly enjoy, is that the conversation has swung from all the attacks that we're getting, all the 0-day and all the technical jargon, to actually IT-based risk. So trying to explain as a stakeholder in a risk conversation with the rest of the board or the C-level exactly what it means, exactly how to mitigate, and understanding that at some point you've mitigated enough and it's time to go buy insurance for the rest and move on.
And when you think about this particular class of attacker, the nation state, in many cases, they're not after everyone, right? It depends on the sensitivity.
You wouldn't know it by the news
company.
cycle, but you're right.
Right. So the sense of really being concerned for most businesses for this particular group or maybe unfounded.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I think kind of just a parting thought here as we close out the arms race section is that we continue to talk about staffing, and we continue to talk about the problems we've had, but I think a lot of the time we simply haven't made the appropriate allocations or optimized the right resources, right?
Right. Can you advance that slide for me? I apologize. So, these target attacks, these A-level, these nation state actors, they are very hard to detect. They're very targeted, very good at what they do, and they elevate privileges. Once they're within a system, they will stay there, be persistent. And they're typically, unsuspected for long periods of time. Dwell times can be as long as, over 100 days.
And it's not even about knowing or being able to detect, because we're getting better at the detection part, we're getting better at the prevention part. It's about do we know where they've gone? And if you think about the way your IT works right now, I bet you have a cloud presence, I bet you have a multi-cloud presence, I bet you have some servers underneath somebody's desk somewhere. So the problem is, how do you protect all the things that you simply have no idea that they exist from people that have more resources, more time, and probably more motivations, a la the government holds their family hostage or something of that nature, right? And let's face it, in some parts of the world, Michael, there is a very valid reason why these people exist. There is a very downtrodden economy, there's not much else to do. Somebody comes along and says, hey kid, you're good with computers, let me pay you a lot of money and keep your family fed. Like, what are you going to do?
Other opportunities than
absolutely, right? And can you hold it against them? Well,
what to do.
Time for another poll?
Yeah, another poll. I'd like to ask our participants here, what type of hacker is your company most concerned about? Those types of commodity threats that are coming in a shotgun approach, those targeted threats, which we see more of, but is really about 20% of what we see, or these advanced targeted threats.
I'm kind of curious to see what some of these responses are, especially how people think, because I'd like to see. I think I would have looked for the button that says "It depends," right? I'm the perpetual lawyer. It's like, okay, but it depends.
Well, a lot of concern this year with what's happened in Iran, and
Yeah.
These are formidable armies that have been created across the world, right? In terms
Yes,
of
they
cyber
have.
armies in Iran and North Korea and China and Russia.
Yeah, I mean, look, when you talk about specifically, you focus on Iran, there's so many different things that you can talk about from the perspective of their capabilities, and it's not that simple as let's block all their IP addresses, because we all know that's not how it works.
Right. The U.S. Budget for cyber is $15 billion in 2019.
That's a lot of scratch.
So we've got some more answers here. It looks like there a lot are concerned about those targeted B-level threats, right? Those that are really out for financial gain and for stealing intellectual property.
And that feels about right, because our audience, yours and mine and Armor's, is definitely that mid-market enterprise. So yeah, that feels about right. That if they're not worried about state-sponsored activities, that means you're probably not putting in $100 million of defense in. But at the same time, you know better than to just think that nobody's targeting you.
Well, and it's also important that in some cybersecurity, cyber insurances, that there are war clauses you need to kind of look for in terms of those kinds of nation state threat actors.
Absolutely.
Right.
That's a webinar all in its own, I think.
I think so too.
All right, let's move along here.
Okay, so just help advance there to the next slide. So let's talk about some of the lessons that we've learned over the last 3 decades, really.
Hopefully learned.
Hopefully learned. And there's a lot, really, in terms of the people and the processes and technology. But maybe we can just kind of go over some of the highlights of those.
Yeah. So I think of this in terms of people, process, and technology, because that's just sort of how my brain works. And from the people aspect, right, the thing that everybody complains about. And I tend to be the contrarian on this. I know there's a cyber workforce shortage. I understand that is absolutely our Achilles heel. But I also understand that from a long-term perspective, you can't actually hire and farm and hire enough people, even if they existed, to do the work that exists to be done today. In 10 years, it's going to be an amount of work that it doesn't matter how many people you have. There are not enough monkeys on typewriters to type out the kind of work that needs to be done. So we need to start focusing on the fact that the work has exceeded our human capabilities by ourselves, right? You can't stare at logs that are 10 gigabytes a day and try to make sense of them. It isn't going to happen. So hiring more people won't necessarily improve what you do today, but I think we need to continue to focus from an enterprise perspective on don't hate me for this, but training people in the right way, right? Not the once a year, do your security training, forget about it, but training people, getting staffing right, keeping the people that we have.
And certainly finding processes where we can automate, right?
Absolutely.
Where we can automate all of those log and data kind of ingestions so that we can, not try to, you can't throw any more people at the issue, right? And make it any faster. We need to develop better playbooks, extensive playbooks, libraries of playbooks, really, for the kinds of things that we see.
That's how we go faster, by having patterns that we can repeat, right? So these long dwell times are not because the incidents weren't detected. We know after the fact analysis that they were detected. It's just somebody didn't act in time, or somebody didn't see it. It didn't get raised up enough. So I mean that makes sense, right? Get those playbooks in there.
And we need to understand the complexity of everything that we're moving to the cloud. The different kinds of attack vectors that are created as we have applications that are speaking to each other.
API to API, process complexity, and just technology complexity is at a level right now that is just hurts your brain. As if you look at where we were, like my light bulb has an IP address and has enough memory that if you exploit it, odds are you can use it to attack the rest of my house. Like that is not something I would have thought about 15 years ago, or maybe even 10 years ago. But it's a very real thing now, right? You can take over somebody's house and somebody's smart homes. Process complexity, I think, is a final thought on process. I think process complexity is too high. We make things too complicated. I think it needs to be simpler. I think it needs to be, those incident response guides that are 40 pages, right, in a binder.
Mm-hmm.
When you realize that you've been compromised and your CEO is about to be interviewed by NBC or CNN or CNBC or whoever it is, and you're like, oh hell, I need to activate the response plan. The first page should not be welcome to the response plan, right? Page 1 through 10 are introduction. You're like, oh my God, how am I going to, like, there should be a call list. There should be things that you right, simple, practiced, repeatable, auditable. And I think that's the final word on process as far as I'm concerned.
Well, and certainly one of the mantras of Armor, right? We really want to make cloud security simple.
Make it simple, absolutely. Right? What about tech, Mike?
Well, the technology, the tools are still poorly integrated. We still are trying to put together disparate tools, 75 plus security tools. Even
I heard like 127 right? In the Fortune 250.
Incredible, right? But CISOs are looking for other kinds of capabilities that that will help them in those strategies, the organization is really just learning how to pull together those kinds of tools, disparate tools, so that they can make some decisions, make some
decisions faster. Well, think about what cloud adoption has done for us. Just as we've finally gotten our tool set and our processes down to where we could defend the castle walls, right? Our squishy M&M model. The fact that we finally got that down, and suddenly the world completely changes because we don't, technology is no longer, we can't be a stopgap anymore. Right? Have credit card, will DevOps, right? It's a thing. Like you can get out in the cloud with your Amex or your Visa card or whatever, and you can go wreak havoc on your IT organizations, put corporate data out and create incidents. How many of those have we seen? Open S3 buckets everywhere.
Right.
I feel like Oprah. You get an open S3 bucket. You get an open S3 bucket. But the reality is there's entirely too many tools out there. There's too many vendors. There's too many processes. The complexity between them is crazy. And it's becoming, and the cloud has absolutely made it untenable.
Well, what do we do for the future, Raph? What are some of the strategies really, and how is it different between the good guys?
I'd say move to a deserted island, but that's not what's on the slide, so we should talk through that.
Well, the threat actors are going to continue to do what works. They're going to continue to look for vulnerabilities, and they're going to continue to look for ways that they can capitalize financially and politically. And you're going to see that the attacks are going to be at scale, and more attacks on specific applications, even within business. You'll find that within an organization, they may be using a number of different SaaS solutions, and accounting may be using one, and sales may be using another. And the attackers are going to continue to look for those opportunities.
Yep.
Right.
I agree.
They'll focus on high value data. That is, financial data, personal data. They'll certainly continue that, and they'll exploit simple misconfiguration of IT. These moves to the cloud, this complexity. They will continue to look for vulnerabilities in those kinds of migrations and in those uses and those transfers of data. They're going to inject bad code into libraries, and there are going to be millions of new software to software kinds of vulnerabilities, these API driven vulnerabilities.
If I may throw something into that, I mean, look, I mentioned the light bulb thing, but like you've got the industrial Internet of Things, you've got the Internet of Things, you've got smart homes, you've got smart meters, smart cars. How long before everything starts to require an anti-malware platform or everything? Why can't we just build things resiliently from the beginning? Bad guys, those that are, I think we're past the hackers term, now we're talking about criminals and bad actors. But these people will continue to exploit, whether it's a wearable device to track where you go every day, your digital transponder in your car, your implantables if you've got a pacemaker or something like that, ATMs, cars, trains, planes, automobiles, right? Everything is up for grabs. And the problem, I think, from an attacker perspective is now you've got this plethora of attack surface. If you're an attacker, it's just sort of like, okay, where do I go first, right?
Right. And they're going to always try and capitalize on that complexity within those systems. And what about the good guys? What is it that they will continue to need to do?
Well, so I think I've got it 5 bullet points basically from the good guys perspective. The thing that you all, if you've heard me talk before, the thing that people are sick of me saying is know your threat model. Don't panic about things that you have no control over or that do not affect you. right? Like we've seen the rise of vulnerabilities that have their own theme song, website, graphic, and everything else. It's like I don't. Most of these are something you should worry about, but a lot of the smaller things, the things that people simply panic about. I've watched companies panic. Spectre Meltdown was the perfect thing. Everybody panicked. Everybody panicked. The people that should have panicked are the cloud providers and the major software distributors, Microsoft, Apple, the like, and then the cloud providers, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, because suddenly they had to fix this on a large scale. At the enterprise level, yeah, if you were an average mid-market company, I mean, it would impact you. Probably not because somebody was going to use that exploit against you, but because suddenly after it was patched, roughly 18 or 20% of your capacity of processing power was going to magically vanish, right? I think that was the bigger threat, but nobody saw that because we were all too panicked, wondering about how we're going to get hacked by China at mom and dad's garage over here. I think gaining more visibility of your assets and the environments that we support is a close second. I can't stress enough how important that is, especially now that we don't have control of the procurement cycle. IT doesn't have control of the procurement cycle. We don't have the ability to say, don't build that server that way, right? We've got infrastructure as code, networking as code, everything as code. So one small mistake in a line of code somewhere deployed in less than 3 seconds globally across 1 million virtual machines, and suddenly you've got a heck of a problem, and nobody knows that it exists. So visibility, the CSPM tool set that's out there, you absolutely should be leveraging it. And if you don't know how to drive it yourself and how to operate it yourself, get a managed provider that can help you with that. Simplifying policies and procedures for realistic use cases. Complexity is the enemy of security, will always be. Right. But knowing how to look at data, knowing how to process events, knowing how to do change management, knowing how to have procedures in place for what happens when the CEO's laptop gets encrypted. Do we call the FBI? Do we pay the ransom? How the heck do you get Bitcoin? Do we have a backup? Has anybody tested it? Like, these are questions that you should already have answered, right? And if you don't, then after this, go do that. Go find the machine that you've backed up recently, find another machine to restore it to, and if it doesn't work, forget everything you're doing in security and look at that for a moment, right? Because that's a problem. Operationalize, integrate, and automate your security tools. I can't stress that enough. I mean, that's how do we solve the person problem? By empowering the people that we have to do more faster with greater efficacy and efficiency. You're not going to be able to hire, if you're sitting there in a 500 person, 1,000 person company, you have 10, 15, 20 IT people, maybe 1 or 2 IT security people, 1.5 if the average is correct, right? Although if you've got half a person, dial 911 right now. Like how do you get through that, and how do you get any kind of scale in security? Well, you got to automate a lot of that, right? A lot of that has to be done without your control. You should not be looking at every piece of data, every alert that comes out. Like, focus on those types of things and then audit the things to make sure that they work. The only way we're going to make this happen is if we reduce the operational burden on the human being, right? And I'm not saying take the human out of the equation, because I don't expect machines to be able to think for me.
We certainly need that analysis, right?
We need that, and that's people like your team. What they do is they sit there and look at all the data that machines can bring us, and then make intelligent decisions on, is this good or is it bad, or is it real, or is it worth pursuing further? But if you've got 100 alerts across your desk an hour, how efficient can you possibly be?
Right.
Not very. Right. And then, of course, last but not least, reduce the operational burden through strategic partnerships. It wouldn't be a sponsored webcast if we didn't talk a little bit about, quite frankly, how to make your life better through us, and reducing alert fatigue, because you've got those problems. I know you do. Everybody does. Alert fatigue isn't reduced by reducing the amount of rules that get triggered. That's the wrong way to do it, right? Getting operationally efficient. Removing the burden of security infrastructure management. I can't believe that 15 years ago, when I was in an organization, we managed all the parent servers for all our antivirus. We managed all the infrastructure that ran our SIM and all the other stuff. Why is security in the business of patching our own stuff when, in fact, that's not our core competency, and we're probably not great at it, and then it becomes a liability, right?
Right.
Lots of stories of security infrastructure, something out there that your vendor's forgotten to patch, you've forgotten to patch, heaven forbid, that you built a box a year ago, that employee leaves, suddenly that box becomes a liability in the security thing because it's trusted on your network, right? Because obviously it's a thing security built. Suddenly becomes a jumping off point for an attacker. How silly do we feel? And then, of course, last but not least, I think it's fair to say that as IT moves to the as a service model, your companies start using Salesforce, your companies start using all these different mechanisms to do everything that doesn't involve installing software locally anymore. Security needs to operate in the as a service model and become more sentient of the fact that you're not going to have 100 servers today, and those same 100 servers are not going to be there next week. You might have 100 right now, 1,000 10 seconds from now, go down to 500, go to 20,000, go back down to 100 or 1. That's just the reality of the new IT. And if you're not prepared for that, it's time to talk to somebody, because there's no amount of good security you can do on a highly dynamic infrastructure on your own.
Well, and add to that, really, just creating an atmosphere, a security posture within organizations, right? So that people are trained and understand that it's important. Right. It's an important business driver.
And I think it bears saying that the security people are not immune to the don't click on bad links, because I think we've all clicked on bad links. So maybe we stop picking on the users now.
Maybe the security guys typically are more likely to click on the links.
Because of course we know better.
Well, we'd like to take some of your questions now. We'll take just a second to let those come through.
Zelda from Topeka, you're on the show. No, I'm just kidding.
So maybe just kind of to start, what is one of the best things that a small business can do to protect themselves from hackers, right? We know that, maybe in terms of risk management, we don't have to worry as much about those nation state threat actors, right?
Yeah, I think small, medium-sized businesses are in this perfect, 11th ring of Dante's hell, because you have things that somebody cares about, right? Because ultimately, I used to hear this, I'm sure you did too. We'd all hear about we are a small company. What do we have that hackers would want? It might not be what they want. It's what you have that you want. You want your data.
Certainly
you want your servers.
Ransomware.
That's exactly correct, right? You have things that people want because you have things that you want. And I think the things that you could probably do to protect yourselves the most in an SMB mid-market kind of space is let somebody help, right? Don't try to go it alone. I know that sounds like self-serving advice, but when you think of the totality of work, let somebody help.
Right, and people who have that experience in security, as opposed to just general in terms of coding.
Rely on the stuff that's native. If you've got AWS, Azure, GCP, if you've got some of these other platforms, rely on the native stuff that comes in through that platform as much as possible to reduce the additional complexity on top of it.
GuardDuty, CloudTrail,
absolutely,
things,
right?
Of course. So our next question, so my company has 500 employees and 2 security people. What should I focus on?
Your resume. Just kidding.
Yeah.
Not kidding. I mean, look, that's the same answer really as the first one, but I think if you've got a small group like that, right, you've got a very small security team, what can you focus on? You can focus on context, you can focus on educating, you can focus on responding to incidents. Maybe managing a SIM 24/7, 365 isn't going to happen with your 2 security people. Maybe running a threat intel shop and doing threat hunting won't happen in your 2-person security team. But those are things those are starting to become table stakes. So you're going to want to either partner with somebody or find a way to get that delivered as a service, rather than just saying, you know what, I can't afford it. There's ways you can, absolutely. And I think especially in small teams like that, right, focus on your business. I think that one of the biggest mistakes companies do is they try to focus, they misunderstand the importance of their IT security professionals. It's not in watching dashboards and looking for the blinking red light. It's helping the business design security in. Let somebody else worry about the stuff that the mundane, the alerts as they scroll by.
Sure. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and please send your comments and suggestions. Let us know how we've done. The webinar will be edited and sent out to everyone who's joined today.
We'll edit out the awkward pauses that we added in there for comic effect
or technical difficulties. But thank you for joining us.
Thanks for being with us, guys.